One, two, three, four.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Steve Lubiana. With his wife Monique, Steve is owner and vigneron at Stefano Lubiana in Tasmania's Derwent Valley. The estate was this week crowned as grower of Australia's best sparkling wine at the Halliday Wine Companion Awards, and Steve and I spoke at length about his quest to craft bubbly that could put champagne to shame. We also spoke about growing up wanting to do what Dad does, making guns and shooting mums, or narrowly missing, a fruit flavour revelation on the apple aisle, how to know you're on the right track when no one shares the road with you, slip-skin fiddliness and Friulian forefathers, biodynamics and the bastard child of Blaufränkisch and Nebbiolo, the butcher, the baker and the cabernet maker, and ramshackle Riverland footy, and why we should all drink all the wines. I started by asking about Bambino Steve's baby steps.
I grew up in the Riverland, a little place called Moorilla. Population, grand total, 200 people. Great little town. I loved it. I used to walk to school, which was fantastic. So I'd come home and have lunch with my grandma, and I'd have, the best Italian food. And also the winemakers would come home and, they would be drinking wine and, I'd be drinking or tasting at least little bits of wine. They'd be saying, yeah, which one's the most tannic one? And they'd put salt in one glass and not in the other. And so from a very early age, I'm talking primary school, I was subjected to all sorts of torture in the wine glass, which is, I didn't really pay a lot of attention. I was just a kid, like 10 or 12 years old. But I suppose it's set the seed for, being interested in wine. I always was interested in what's Dad doing down there, because, the winery was just 50 meters up the hill. It was just a big playground, honestly, just a big playground where I just, play Spider-Man around. And, it was a huge winery and there's old asbestos roof. And yeah, I'd muck around there, and otherwise we'd go out in the bush, out rabbit trapping and eating oranges, lots of oranges around, because Riverlands back then it was a mixed orchards by most of the orchardists, they were called. Had some grapes, some oranges, some apricots. And we'd cut apricots during the school holidays or work in the winery, which I said, I was, get sick of that after a while. So I'd go cut apricots and then go, holy shit, this is really hard work. I'll go back to the winery and wash barrels again. All the wine was sold in big wooden barrels of varying sizes, from 300 litres to 350, thereabouts, ballpark. Every barrel was totally different in size and unique. So we used to, I remember, well, not me because I was too little, but they'd fill the barrels up. I'd help put the bungs in, and the barrels were all made out of, I think, redwood. That was an Australian hardwood, and so they're just full of splinters. They'd fill them up, and then they'd put some hessian in the bung hole, and then drive a hardwood bung into that bung hole, and then cut a piece of tin, and with lots of little tacks, tack that tin or nail that down over the bung hole so it couldn't be tampered with while it was being sent away. And then the trucks would come, and I'd help them roll them onto the semi-trailer, and then they would, too heavy for me, but pick them up on their ends, and off it would go.
Was this a partnership or your dad's own business?
It's my dad's winery. Yeah, my dad's own business. Yeah.
Did he have other people working there as well?
Yeah. There was, probably full time. There would be about 4 or 5 in the winery, and then vintage time, probably another 4. They used about a couple of 1,000 tonne, 3,000 tonne. So, quite a bit of wine. Yeah.
Yeah. What grape varieties?
Oh, gee, whatever was grown in the area. Shiraz, Mataro, Gordo. Not much Sultana, because that was a real shit to process. We didn't have the machinery, because being a slip skin, it's difficult to get the juice out of. Chenin Blanc, French Colombard, yeah, Malbec, all sorts. Yeah, whatever was Doradillo, and they'd make white wine out of those white grapes, and a lot of them were skin fermented. So, like, I was exposed to that very early on. We would have hundreds of tons of skin fermented white wine just to get some texture and body out of these grapes that had nothing. And so, again, family coming from the Friuli area of northern Italy, 'Cause it's only like a few years ago, these sort of skin fermented whites were sort of popular. And I'm thinking, hang on, this shit, hang on a minute. Back in the 70s, we were doing hundreds of tons of the bloody stuff. Not as refined, of course, but still the same technique. And also just to help press the wines as well. So if they were really slippery skins, when you try to press them, they just sort of squeeze out your fingers everywhere because of the protein content. But if you ferment them for a few days, that breaks the protein down, and then you can squeeze them and get the juice out easier. So, it sort of helped both ways.
Was your father the first generation of Lubianas to be born in Australia?
No, my father was born in Monfalcone in northern Italy. So I'm the first, yeah. Yeah, my grandpa came over first. My grandfather, he was the first to come over, and then my father followed him. I think it was about a year later, in 1950, 51, thereabouts.
Obviously, really immersed then in the outdoors, in the fruit growing, in the food culture. Were you always a very experimental soul?
Oh, yeah. Experimental, but also very mechanical. I used to make a lot of things. I remember I made a gun once out of a bike tube and whittled down a wooden stock to fit the bike tube into it. And then I put a penny bun cracker down, got the wick to sort of poke out the bottom where you would normally screw in your hose. Wadded it with some paper and a marble. And I was sitting outside and I had it pointed to the kitchen door. I lit this thing off, and it went off the hell of a bang, and it shot this marble through the screen door, ricocheted through the back of the kitchen window, come back towards the screen door, and my mum was standing there, missed her head by about, I don't know, a couple of inches. Needless to say, that was the last time I saw that weapon I made. But I used to make all sorts of stuff. Yeah, it was. I was very, very hands-on. Had my own toolbox and used to fix things around the place. I loved it. Well, my dad's not hands-on at all. I used to fix things for him.
And so at school, those things that you were good at, were they the sort of more mechanical kind of things?
Yeah.
Science as well?
Science, yeah, not too bad. Biology, I found pretty easy. I always knew I wanted to become a winemaker, so after primary school, high school, I went down the science path. Maths wasn't my strong subject, but biology, chemistry wasn't too bad. Wasn't crazy about it. I was very young. And I realised that when I first went to primary school, I couldn't communicate very well. And then afterwards, I realised that, of course, Italian was my first language. At home, we always spoke Italian. And then first going to school, like, well, I can't really talk to anybody. And then I made friends. You pick up English pretty quickly, but that sort of set me back a few years.
Right. And how did you socialise with the other kids? Were you sporty?
Yeah, very sporty. So, always water skiing up the Riverland. It's a big thing. Just hiking out in the bush, rabbit trapping, shooting. It's all Wild West back then in the late 70s and early 80s. At high school, I played footy for the local football club, which I loved. It's just like on YouTube, like you can imagine those Aussie teams where you got a town of 200 people. You got the butcher, the baker, the bank manager, and from 50-year-old to very 12-year-old, all on the same team. I think when I left, they actually won the premiership one year, which was fantastic. But it was a lot of fun, and the whole town was there watching the games, and all the cars parked up around the football oval and tooting their horns. Really old school, a lot of fun, good times.
Sounds fun. Did you cook from a young age as well?
Yeah, a little bit. Always looked over the shoulder of my mum or grandma cooking, and I took a great interest in what they were doing. I didn't do a lot of cooking, to tell you the truth. Did a bit, but remember waking up always to grandma plucking chickens at the breakfast table. That was an everyday occurrence, or picking fresh asparagus. In Moorilla, back in the day, they had open channels for the water. Along the open channels, wild asparagus would grow all around the place. And so there was a race for all the local Italians. You'd walk around and get the asparagus before the other Italian family would get it. Because you'd go walking along and say, "Oh shit, the asparagus is all gone. Oh, those buggers down the road there have got it before us." So it was pretty funny, and that was fantastic asparagus. Very spindly, very thin, but just loaded with flavour. Yeah, it's awesome.
I don't know if it's becoming rarer that you get children looking over their parents' shoulders, thinking, "I want to do what Dad does when I grow up." But obviously it was a thing for you. A lot of the time parents don't want their kids to do what they did because they think it's a bad idea. But you had that idea pretty young.
Very young.
How did you then go towards making that a reality?
My parents were pretty keen on me to go to high school. And I was a very obedient child. Whatever my parents said, I just did it. And they weren't unreasonable. They're really good people. And they said, and then you can go as Roseworthy College to learn how to make wine. And I said, yeah, sure, I'll love to go. And so, yeah, everything was set up from high school, doing the right subjects to get into Roseworthy College. And I remember going to meet with Bryce Rankin. He came over and saw Dad and I. Said, "Oh, so your son wants to come?" I said, "Yeah, we'd like to get in." He said, "Yeah, no worries. You're welcome." It was always very well planned.
Right, and who were your peers at Roseworthy?
Oh, quite a few of us. A good friend of mine, Andrew Peace, who's got Andrew Peace Wines. We've got Bill Morrodellis down the road. He was in my class. Vanya Cullen, Matt Aldridge, Nick Butler, a few Kiwis as well. Quite a few of us, yeah.
You had a good time there? Picked up some good work experience?
A lot of drinking experience. A lot of beer drinking at uni. I think like probably most unis, and probably things haven't changed, I'd imagine. It's amazing how I still can remember things, what was in class and what we studied. It's sort of the back of my mind, and all the chemistry and things like that. It sort of sinks in. It didn't seem that important back then, but then after you work and you're actually doing it, you think, that actually applies. Maybe it didn't make as much sense, well, at the time we were doing it, but then certainly afterwards you can see where it all fits in. And then the work experience at uni, I went to Lewin Estate, so that's where I did my vintage, which was really good. Again, being a young kid, you always start at the bottom, so it was just cleaning presses pretty much most of the time, but that's okay. It's still important.
Did you find that you'd had so much sort of hands-on experience from being a really young child, though, that you were ready to do more?
Oh yeah, I mean, I was every vintage while I was at uni. Every vintage was at home, which was fortunate because it's January and vintage was on, and then after vintage, I'd go to uni. So all while I was growing up, I was working vintages. I was allowed to ferment things, do little trials. Or actually, when I was even younger, I think primary school or just after primary school, I wanted to do a Amarone. Because I liked Amarone as a kid, powerful, rich wines. And so we got some, I think it was Matara grapes that we dried out inside the winery, and they hung around for quite a while. And then I think I must have, I don't know where I went, back to school or something, and everybody got the shits and threw it all into a ferment and got rid of it. But I nearly made an Amarone, but not quite.
So what would be the first wine proper that you ever made and said, that's mine? I did that.
Well, we get to make a wine at uni, so I did that. I did a Colombard with two of my mates, and so we did that. Picked the grapes all the way through, made the wine, and bottled it. So I suppose that's the first one, but not by myself. By myself, it would have been in 1987, I reckon. After I finished uni, I went to overseas for a year or two, and I came back, and then took over my dad's winery, and then so saw the whole process through from grapes to bottle.
And where did you go overseas? You're in Champagne for a bit during that trip, were you?
Yeah, so in 1985, I spent 6 months there, roughly, in Champagne, and also up in the Alps. But did the whole season in Champagne. I lived in Chuy, worked in Bissau, stayed at a guy's named Lionel Legras. He's a lovely person, and him and his wife Dominique, who looked after me. And so it was really interesting there. Working in the cave, did a lot of riddling, tiraging, and then that was all before harvest came. And then when the fruit came in, loading the press and doing all the other chores around the winery. So it was interesting. Yeah, looking at the fruit and tasting the wines, and living there and looking at the vineyards. I just go running through the vineyards pretty regularly. It was a good experience.
Was that a very deliberate choice to go to Champagne?
Yes, very much so. I've always liked sparkling wine, so that was just a natural choice for me, which sort of led on to ultimately moving to Tasmania, I suppose.
And so in those intervening years, after returning from Europe, you spent, about 5-6 years back at home in the Riverland?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'd always, even though I was travelling during the year, January was always at home working with Dad, doing the vintage. So 85, got back in January, did the vintage in 86. I worked at in Chianti for the 86 vintage at Castello di Ama in Gaiole, which makes some lovely red wines. And then when I got back from that, then I basically took over. My dad wanted to retire, and so I sort of worked for him for a year or two, pretty much running the winery side of things. Then I met my wife and married Monique, and then we leased my dad's winery, and he left, moved to the Barossa. We had a winery there, and then we ran the winery ourselves from, I think it was 1987 onwards, or 88.
Where did you meet Monique?
In Moorilla, actually at a party. Her best friend is Andrew Pierce's wife. So, so he introduced us, or they introduced us, and we hit it off, and it was, never looked back.
Was she from a wine family background or fruit growing background?
No, not at all. Her family had a R.M. Williams shop in Mildura. She comes from a big family of 10. Yeah. No history there or background. She's just a really good worker, good work ethic, I should say. Yeah, so did she embrace it? She absolutely did, yeah. We're very much one team. What we've achieved together, very much so.
And so when did you start broadening your horizons beyond Riverland to where your own dream with your and Monique's name on it would take place?
Yeah, I think probably around 88 we were thinking, is this where we want to stay, in the Riverland and make these sorts of wines? And we thought, we actually had enough of the heat as well. Like, it gets pretty hot there, and I think growing up there, we just wanted a change. But that wasn't the driving force. The driving force was my idea to make sparkling wine. And so in 89, we started looking around Australia. It took a while, didn't rush. We ended up actually going to Tasmania. I think so. We must have been married in 89. I think. I can't remember. This is terrible.
Sorry.
And so we spent our honeymoon in Tassie, sort of killing two birds with one stone, looking at vineyards and prospective sites. A little bit of that, not too much.
Yep.
And that was like, oh yeah, this is definitely the place. So spent a bit more time in Tassie, came back, looked around, and found a block of land here, which we purchased in 1990, and we started our quest.
And on that front, were there any misgivings? Obviously, you found the right potential conditions for the sparkling idea, but there wasn't that much of a template there. And perhaps moving from a background where you were surrounded by grapes and vineyards and wine growers, going to Tassie when there wasn't a huge amount going on in that respect, was there ever a time when you thought, is this a bit of a plunge into the unknown and a bit far away from what we know?
No. Absolutely not. Never. I was 100% sure we'd make fantastic wine down here. No doubt in my mind. Yeah. Just had to do it and make it happen. When we came here, we tasted the strawberries and the berries. Had some good wines. Andrew Pirie was making some wines back then, which were pretty good. And there wasn't a lot of wine about. So that just everything had so much flavour. We thought, oh, gee. And then, finding the right site, very important in a cool climate. And, I think the proof's been in the pudding. We've been very happy with the quality that we're getting here. Yeah, site is everything, I think. It's more important than vine age. If you've got the right spot, it doesn't matter what you do. You're not going to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear.
And from that point of view, just explain, if you could, put us in the picture of exactly where you are and what the vineyard has going for it.
Yeah, so we're down south of Tasmania, which is a little bit drier than up north where we are. We're inland, so we're 20 kilometres upstream, inland from Hobart, along the banks of the Derwent River. We're on the southern bank, which means we have a gentle slope facing north to capture radiant sun and heat. Maybe a little bit of reflection off the river as well, because it's quite wide where we are. And we're further enough inland where we don't get too much of a sea breeze. We get a little bit, but close enough so that we don't get spring frost issues. We have plenty of water coming through our property, so that's not an issue because it's a very dry site. Well, Hobart's 500 millimetres. We're probably about 400 millimetres annual, so quite dry, which means low disease pressure, which makes it easier to grow grapes. So we have all the ingredients that we want. We also have low vigour soil. We don't have any high vigour rich soils, which means we can control the rate of growth of the vines and how much they grow, which is, I think, quite important in a cool climate where you're trying to make wines of concentration, looking at lower yields. So if you want to have low yields and your vine's growing like crazy, then you're sort of fighting nature, and that's not so easy.
And when did you set up shop properly in Granton?
So we came down in 1990, and There was a market garden here, so I ran that for 18 months and then was just losing money and going backwards, but grew some fantastic vegetables. But then realised that, hang on a minute, like we're just trading water, wasting time here. We've got to get back into what we came here for, and that is growing grapes and making wine. So we planted our first vines, and I suppose our first proper vintage was 1993.
We're going back a long way. As we said, back in Tasmania, there wasn't a lot of wine around there. How difficult was it, and what were the difficulties you faced in the first couple of years?
So, yeah, we didn't have any money. It was, land was very expensive. So we bought about 600 hectares, of which we chopped off and subdivided land as much as we could, the parts that weren't suitable for vineyards, to help cover our costs. Interest rates were about 15% at the time. It was very expensive. We bought a house for, I think it was about $5,000, just an old house, and put it on the back of a truck and then put it on some legs and lived in that for 10 years with the wind blowing through the floorboards, with no insulation in the walls. It was freezing. It was tough, and a tiny little house, you can imagine, it was 6 meters by 12 meters, which we brought up our family, kids in. So there was that. Monique was working. She worked in Hobart for a freight company as a secretary, just in the office, just to bring in extra income while we were setting up. And I bought machinery for my father. And once he sold his winery, I bought the press and some tanks and things like that off of him, which I brought over and set up on a pad and did some contract work. So I started buying whatever I could find and then selling those juices or wines to mainland wineries just to get cash flow while we pumped that into vineyard establishment. So it was pretty tough and sort of unfortunate, but fortunately that was the time when Moorilla estate, had trouble and went through receivership. And so I sort of scrounged around and picked up all their contracts, to get the income from those, a bit of contract winemaking. So that was the important part for us. And that continued for probably about 10 years, where we were building our business, doing contract work to get the cash flow in the door while we pumped that money into vineyards. And buying grapes it was difficult, and then buying the right grapes, grapes that I want. Might be grapes around, but if it's not grown in the right area that I'm looking for, or overcropped, or not managed correctly, I've got a philosophy that you do it yourself to get what you want. So we are very much down the vigneron path.
And what varieties did you plant first of all on the vineyard?
Pinot and Chardonnay, and a little bit of Savvy. Yeah, we planted it organically because organics is a big part of what we do. And it was very steep, secondhand posts. It was old hop poles, actually, that from the hops fields. And then secondhand irrigation, and had holes in it everywhere. Wallabies were jumping in and eating everything. And it was steep, and the tractor was secondhand, and that was sliding sideways into everything. It was just a nightmare. So we quickly pulled the pin and moved the vineyard down and went conventional in the lower, flatter areas. Still got some gentle slope, but much, much easier to manage. And we put all new posts and trellising in and irrigation, and that was fantastic. And then from there we slowly extended the vineyard every year. Whatever cash spare money we had, we put it all into vineyard. Like now we have about 26 hectares.
And setting out to grow very fine, world-class sparkling wine, obviously you set yourself another high target, but one that takes a fair while to get round to. When did you feel things were in motion properly for Stefano Lubiana?
I'd made some sparkling, started making sparkling in 86. That was my first sparkling wine in the Riverland. And I was actually making sparkling wine back there. So I had a few vintages under my belt, doing tiraging and degorging, all that sort of thing. So 1993, with Purchased Fruit, was our first year, and very happy with the quality of the wine that came out. And it was just, again, learning on the job with the fruit that you've got, slowly improving it every year, learning that we need to do malolactic fermentation in Tasmania, but finding it very difficult because it's you got a pH of 2.9, an acid of 12 grams, and it's 12 degrees outside. So how the hell are you going to get that and go through malo? Almost impossible. Solving those sorts of issues, but we got there in the end. Wrapping tanks up with roof insulation and fish tank heaters. So heating is the thing. So in the Riverland, cooling everything was important, but in Tasmania, heating is really important just to make sure ferments finish before they get too cold.
And in terms of milestones on the journey, I suppose, those things that vindicated your faith in the site and your decision to move to Tasmania, do you remember any kind of breakthrough moments where you and Monique looked at each other and thought, yeah, we're on the right track, this is going to work? Or were you just working too bloody hard to even think about it?
Just working too hard. Basically, we just those breakthrough moments probably occurred, every time we'd crack a bottle of our sparkling and said, let's have a quick taste before we, have dinner. And then, halfway through dinner, going to pour the next, glass and the bottle's empty. And go, oh yeah, no, that was good. And that is still my litmus test. If the wine's good and you go to grab it and top up your glass and the bottle's empty, you say, yeah, that's drinkability. And it's just gone down so easy that, it's good wine. And that's, to me, yeah, I love that. Love that when that happens. It doesn't happen all the time, but yeah. And, I think we've just always had faith in our palates and been very self-critical and trying to drink broadly so that you got a good benchmark.
Yeah, Tasmania is seen as being, by most outsiders, a relatively small space. And I suppose with most vineyards concentrated on one side in a way. But at the same time, you're not many operators operating in little pockets a bit removed from one another, with actually quite different regional conditions as well. Through the 90s, did you have some local-ish support in terms of young vignerons going through the same kind of things as you who helped keep you cheerful and keep you positive?
Oh, not really. I wish we did. It's just not many of us down here then. Now there's quite a few, and we all get together in Hobart and have drinks and, wine clubs and things like that. But back then it was just too few and far between. So, yeah, unfortunately we had to sort of suck it up and do it ourselves. But, we loved it. It's not work when you love what you do. And, going to work every day, no matter, we were doing 12-hour days, 7 days a week. We did that for about 10 years. So it was a hard slog. But hard slog, but still, we'd do it over again, I suppose, if we had to, because it was just so rewarding.
And very early on in the piece, certainly in the broader scheme of things, you moved to organic and biodynamic viticulture. What was the spur for that, and what did it entail for you? What kind of results did you enjoy from it?
I suppose the spark started quite early one day when I was ruffling through my dad's paperwork back in the Riverland, and I saw this paper chart. And it was a moon chart of the phases of the moon, and inside that chart were all the winemaking phases. And I said to Dad, "What's this, Dad?" He said, "Oh, that's Nonor's, that's Grandpa's, Andrea. That's one of his winemaking charts. How he used to make wine." I said, "What?" And it just really struck me, and I thought that's pretty wild. And then I sort of put aside and forgot about it. And then it would have been maybe 89. Something like that, 90. Before we just moved to Tasmania, I saw a Four Corners program on biodynamics, and it was all about Alex Podolinsky. And he was the head of biodynamics in Australia at the time. And it's just all about biodynamics and his farm. And I thought, oh, yeah. It just resonated with our philosophies, I think, to keep things natural, how we, growing up in an Italian household where we had a garden and we would grow our radicchio and rucola and grow our own food and eat wild food pretty regularly, sort of nothing really out of a packet. And so Monique and I said, look, this, she was on board as well straight away. Said, yeah, no, this is absolutely how we want to grow grapes. Yeah, so we bought our stirring machine. I don't know if I bought it in South Australia or as soon as we came to Tassie. So we're on board straight away. And that's what our first vineyard in 1990 was planted organically, but then, failed. And then we started again in 2010.
What does it mean in terms of how you act and how you respond and what it does for your fruit?
To me, it's almost like a way of life, almost. We all eat organic food, and in the vineyard, to me, it's all about respect. It's respect for the land, respect for the worker going in there, and respect for the person eating or drinking the product at the end, so that you're doing the right thing. We don't need to be adding lots of chemicals or any chemicals, really. I'm talking about synthetic chemicals to food. I mean, adding sulfur and copper, spraying that in your vines, that's enough. I mean, you don't really need to, go down that road of adding anything stronger when you have a healthy vine. And that's the bit that I think some people might misunderstand, is that it's not just stopping one thing, it's you're strengthening the vine. And it takes a while. Like when we first converted to biodynamics, those vines suffered a bit. Like the canopy shrunk. It was getting drip fed, lolly water, all this easy nutrients for the years preceding, and then all of a sudden you turn the tap off and say, "Hang on, fellas, you got to go find those nutrients. You got to start making friends with the fungi in the soil, and work a little bit harder." And what it does, it makes the vines very resilient, very sort of strong. And so, I find that when we get, a heat wave or wet conditions, the vines pull through much better. And as a side bonus, just the bonus is that I think we get more flavour, better flavour. We get flavour earlier in the season. So as the vines ripen, flavour comes in earlier. So we can pick, luckily, at a lower bome and achieve very well balanced wines with good intensity and very much a sense of place. And if you like terroir driven wines, well, that's what you're going to get, because that's what the vines are showing. They're only showing that terroir. It comes through with clarity when there aren't any other obfuscating factors in there.
And speaking of wine, when it comes to those sparkling wines that you wanted to realise, you've obviously come out with a suite of them. The very well regarded for a very long time now non-vintage wine. There's been vintage rosé, vintage white wines, Blanc de Blanc, and late disgorged vintage wines. What is the secret for you to finding the absolute point where you nail those wines?
I think it definitely starts in the vineyard. I'm getting the right clones to start with. I don't like the I-10 clones, the Davis clones. I think they've just got too much fruit. I don't want fruity characters too much in the juice. So some austerity, I think, is a good thing, but within balance. Mid-palate weight is also very important. I need to have texture and fleshiness, so I need to build that in the vineyard. If I can get good flavour at a lower bome, that means I can maybe remove a few leaves early in the season, really around flowering, to let a bit of sun in to build some characters on the fruit, knowing that I'm going to pick it at around about 10 to 10 and a half, 11 bome. But if I picked it a little bit riper, that would be a mistake, and I would have too much flavour in the fruit. So playing that razor's edge, having that fruit very slightly exposed, but good, strong canopy. So I think sparkling wines, for me, I like the grapes that have got a very strong canopy, and the fruit comes in, for pale green colour. So it hasn't got any yellow colours or obvious sunburnt, any sun-affected fruit. And then it's just a question of, whole bunch pressing it, and just keeping the cuvee pretty much, and then, not sulfuring too early, but just pretty much going like we do now. We just sort of press and go straight to fermentation, and then not tiraging too early, just leaving it there a little bit. If I'm going to put it away for 10, 11 years, I would tirage a bit earlier than normal, because its development and complexity comes with just time on lees. Or a non-vintage or a Brut Reserve, where it only has 2 years on lees, I would let that develop a little bit in tank or in barrel, and maybe lose a bit more fruit and build some complexity there, and together with some base wine blending, so its complexity comes earlier and quicker, and also a bit more Pinot. So longer term cellaring, tirage, I think Chardonnay plays a more important part. But if it's short term, I think Pinot develops quicker. I find that down in Tassie, and so more Pinot dominant for the Brut Reserve.
Speaking of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, then obviously that's been another quest in the long run to take those to ever greater heights. Did you feel in the earlier days that you knew what the top of the mountain looked like when it came to Tasmanian still wines from Pinot Noir and Chardonnay? Have you been surprised and delighted at the potential that you've discovered?
Absolutely. I think I've seen just so many great wines coming out of Tassie now, and even our wines have improved out of sight over the last 15 years. We've been making wine here, for 34 years. and I think the quality's just increasing constantly. Vine age is playing a big part of that as well, and also new techniques, and just seeing what other growers are doing in Tassie. It's just a great place, and I think it's just slightly warmer. Weather's changed very slightly, and I think you're getting a bit more plushness in our wine, less austere than they used to be. Yeah, and be learning how to deal with the fruit.
What is it you're looking for in Chardonnay?
I love Chardonnay. Monique and I drink that like water. To me, a really good Chardonnay needs lovely structure. So it's good to have a nice tension, good fleshy palate, but fine, lovely concentration, not too ripe. I don't like too much alcohol. Oak in the background, just a touch of flinty reduction if it's there. It's not a deal breaker if it isn't, but really good length. And full malo, I think, it is critical for me. Even in sparkling, I'm not keen on wines that don't have full malo. Like a Krug, for example, I can see the malic acid in Krug. I mean, here I am complaining about Krug, but it's great, but it's certainly not my favourite. Yeah, and you get that finesse, that creaminess, that lovely lactic acid, that what it brings to the wine. And in Chardonnay, yeah, I don't want to see overt tropical fruit and things like that. Wine that's gone through some good élevage and spent time and not rushed into bottle.
And you seem to enjoy, partly climatically perhaps, a great deal of tension in your wines. Is that something that you think site is absolutely critical for having that balance of powerful flavour with really tight, exciting energy?
Absolutely, and I think tension is important, and transparency. Monique and I also call it, where a wine would be just sees through the wine, so they're elegant, they have lovely tension, but tension without being skinny. And like some Chardonnays in the last 10 years have come out where it's just very light, very thin, huge amounts of tension, but they've got nothing else. They've got no flesh, no body. And it tastes more like a Riesling, which is not what we're after. So tension, you have to be careful not to overdo it. So you do need grapes that are ripe, but luckily we can get good tension with, grapes that are 13% alcohol. So I'd like to see a little bit of alcohol, not too much. I mean, but not 12%. I like some ripeness and and body in our Chardonnays and Pinots for that matter. So keeping that acidity in the wine and having it go through malo is a fine balance.
And how about Pinot Noir? You're probably going to find it difficult to characterise even Derwent Valley as a regional Pinot Noir style, but how does your part of the Derwent Valley and your site express itself in Pinot, and what are you trying to pursue in those wines?
We get very opulent Pinot, lots of fruit, soft, round fruit, a significant amount of phenolics and tannin, just natural tannin that comes with the fruit. Saying that, we've moved to whole bunch fermentation to even get more tannin, and we like those wines. We love those wines. And that's, I suppose, a style change that sort of happened. But saying that, 2009 vintage was a 30% whole bunch wine back in the day, and that's still one of my favourites. And so going back and seeing how that wine's developed, and thinking, well, that was great. And then looking through my records, very meticulous winemaking records, to see, oh yeah, okay, that was a 30% whole bunch fermentation. And so that sort of given me confidence to revisit those sorts of numbers now again. Because we do get that phenolic maturity in the vineyard early, and it allows us to take that approach without getting green herbal characters in our wines. I don't want to see whole bunch character too much. I just want it in the background, but not obvious. And I think we can get that at our site because of the warm site that we are, relatively warm in a cool climate.
Your site also gives you that thing that lovers of Chardonnay and Pinot and, well, lovers of great wines generally love to play with, and that is a little bit of variation as well.
Yeah, we're quite lucky that we've got so many different soil types in our property. We had the University of Tas come out with the geology students to do a soil survey years ago, and they had an excavator here. We dug, I don't know, 20, 30 pits all over the place. And like the professor said, look, we could be here for weeks. You've got so many different things going on, different soil types and changes and whatnot. So all these different soil types enable us to, fine tune the winemaking to that soil type, and then to enhance the flavors that we get from that soil. So we have some sandy, lighter soil over gravel, which we use more for sparkling fruit. We have some Terra Rossa style soil, which we use for Pinot. And then we have some heavier clay soils over gravelly clay, which we use for Pinot and Chardonnay, but mostly Pinot. And then we have a large section of silty gravel over gravelly clay, which we have Pinot and Chardonnay. And each one offers something different. We find that we can, the silty gravel, the porous soils, we can do a whole bunch of fermentations pretty well. But if the soil's more vigorous, again, what holds more water, like a clay, we have to be very careful with the whole bunch. I think biodynamics is quite forgiving. I don't know. Let us do things that maybe we couldn't do otherwise. Yeah, my suspicion.
Perhaps as well, without really thinking of it that way, it is making you listen to what the vine's doing. So you're probably working with it naturally and responding to it more readily constantly.
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of biodynamics, and that is observation. So because you don't have a plethora of techniques at your disposal to manage that vineyard, you have to be very observant and look at issues and problems, early on, like weeds, for example. That's probably our biggest problem in the vineyard. So we're really onto weed management. We can't control it completely without spending a lot of diesel and time in the vineyard. So we manage it enough. And then some blocks might get more treatment than others because we know that particular block has a shallower root system, so it needs a bit more protection. While that other block there's got deeper roots, it's got a bigger canopy. It can get by with a few more weeds. So identifying that and managing those blocks to what they require, I think really helps bring the best out of those grapes.
We've mentioned your focus when you found the vineyard on sparkling wine and how both still Chardonnay and Pinot Noir have undergone enormous evolution in both quality and the tiers of wines that you now offer at Stefano Lubiana. But of course, your focus has been relatively broad beyond that as well. I mean, there are other wines you love making. Tell us a little bit about some other varieties that you like working with.
Well, when we first planted the vineyard, we did put some other grapes in that we like as varietals, but they also really help us spread the vintage out a bit because Pinot Chardonnay just comes in all together at the same time. And it's hard when you've got a small winery to have too much fruit coming in. So having other varieties like Riesling, Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc stretches out the vintage a bit, gives you more time to look after those wines and get them in the winery and make your wine. And also, we weren't really sure. We wanted some, backup. We thought, okay, we've got Pinot Chardonnay. People were all drinking Shiraz and Cabernet at that time. And we're thinking, okay, we can plant these other varieties. So that was a bit of an insurance policy as well. And so we do make a bit of Sauvignon Blanc. That's changed quite a bit. Same with Riesling. We're making them, much tighter, much fresher. They're all fermented in Austrian oak foederers now, all naturally fermented. While in the past they were maybe picked a bit riper and more opulent and tropical, less austere and a bit more mainstream, but not anymore. We had Cabernet Franc planted, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. And, Cabernet Franc, we found very quickly that doesn't perform down here. It's just so green and weedy and it's hard to make a good wine. So that lasted just a few years, a few vintages, and out it went. Got grafted over to Merlot, which was performing, much better. And even the Cabernet, it was making a great wine like 1 year in 4. And that's not enough. You're fighting nature, and you're never going to win fighting nature. So we put a bit more Merlot in and also some Malbec, which we really like, and that's performing extremely well as well. And so now we blend the Malbec with our Merlot and make a wine out of that, which we really do like. It's consistently very good. We're very happy with that wine. Totally different to Pinot Noir, but made by a Pinot Noir maker. So very gentle, I suppose. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and you also spent a vintage overseas in Austria with a fellow biodynamic visionary, Gerhard Pittnauer. What did you enjoy about working at the Pittnauer winery, and was there anything that you brought home with you from that experience?
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. He's a top guy, Gerhard and Bridget. Lovely guy to work with. I suppose the take-home message with Gerhard was just to really trust your own palate. Don't overthink everything. Like he started making wine when he was 16, taking over his father's winery. And so we both come from that same long time, making wine for many, many years. After you've made wine for 40 years, over 40 years, geez, if you're second guessing yourself all the time, you haven't learned anything. So just go with it. Go with your gut. You're going to be right, probably. Yeah. So that was the message.
And also, he's an experimental fella, and you've done quite a lot of those, I suppose you might say, left of field things. You've never stopped harking back to your father's homeland, I suppose, playing a bit with skin contact
Mhm.
wines and various other styles. Is it just curiosity? Does it lead somewhere? Does it matter?
Yeah, like I did a vintage at Radicon, which was really great with Sasha. I like those wines as well, but I don't drink them as much as I do, say, just more conventional Burgundian sort of style of wines. But they still have an important place on the table because you can't drink Pinot and Chardonnay for everything. I drink broadly. I like my Rieslings, I like my skin fermented wines, Bordeaux blends, sherries. With the right food, you're going to have the right matching wine, I think. Certainly not just focused at the kitchen table on just two wine styles. I think, there's so many beautiful wines in the world. Let's just drink them all, Look, Sicilian wines. I love Caricante and Norella Muscalese. Beautiful. Barolo, Barbaresco. Fantastic wines. Just gorgeous. Get the right food, nice bit of wild boar or something like that. What are you going to have?
Obviously, growing up with your hands on experience around food and wine from a very early age, that's probably where you have to say it's Steve Lubiana's element out in the vineyard, playing with plants, playing with fermentations, etc. How do you feel about the work selling wine? Is it something that you find lends balance to your life as a vigneron? Is it a chore? And is it hard to connect being over in Tasmania when the world is a little bit further away?
Yeah, it's not one of my favourite jobs. I'm certainly happier in the vineyard, like you're saying, playing with plants and things like that. But it's important, to get the wine out there, and it's our income. It's my job. We don't have any other income. Just it's all wine. So we've got to keep that cash coming in to finance the next year's crop, pay all the pickers, the pruners. And it's good to see the response because otherwise you're in a cocoon. And if you don't know what do people think of the wine? Like, I don't know. Are they drinking it? Like, hopefully, are they buying it and tipping it out? I don't know. So, getting to Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane and Perth and Adelaide to see what people think, it's important, I think, and see what's happening in the scene. Yeah, just got to do it. It's a job. People say, "Oh, what are you complaining about? You're going over there, you're drinking all day and eating out at nice restaurants," which is yeah, sure, but it's work, and yeah, it could be worse things to do, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm sure when you go to those places that you find that the wines are well liked. Do you feel surprised that what you do and where you're coming from as a grower is well understood by other people and well received by them?
I think it's received fairly well, but I don't know about if it's well understood. I think that's part of getting out and actually meeting people and telling the story, if they're interested. If they're interested, what is behind the wine, and that's what I like to drink wines from other vignerons and people and hear their story. What are they trying to do with this wine? What's their message? What's the message of this wine? I don't want to get too intellectual and too nerdy, but there's always an underlying theme or message then, and I like to get that message because it just makes the whole experience more interesting and satisfying.
And what about working with Marco? He's been doing a lot of work under his own label, but also with the family as well.
Mhm.
Is it very gratifying to work with, obviously, Monique, with that shared vision that you've had and shared work ethic, having Marco and others in the business to keep that going? And what does it bring to both the feeling of the place, but also the vision of where you're going?
Yeah, that's great. I like working with Marco. We think very much along the same lines. We drink much the same wines. I have a lot of faith in him. He's very particular, very sold on biodynamics, very strict, which is great. I'd still like to have the final say on my blends, on my barrels, and he sometimes he asks me, "Oh, can I have a couple of those barrels put in my wine?" And I think, well, yeah, I think they will help your wine. So yeah, you grab those. So I'm not going to be mean and not share, but because in the end of the day, it'll be his. He'll be making all the wines at one point in the future. But I still will. I think until I can walk, I'll be blending wines like my grandpa. He was blending wines until he's 85 or something like that. And that was, I've so many memories of him and photos of him spending hours, like literally hours, sitting with measuring cylinders and making blends. And I can see myself doing exactly the same thing because I just enjoy it, love it.
And what about the future? What is it you look forward to? Is there any projects that you're working on at the moment that you're really enjoying? Or is it just the idea that you're going to hopefully carry on making wonderful wines, having an even better sense of who you are and what your vineyard is and what it's bringing to other people?
Yeah, so I think, just refining, chiseling down our winemaking, which is still, I think there's not much to do now. It's, selecting the right barrels. Again, our winemaking is in the vineyard, so we won't be changing any clones. We've got another little block of Chardonnay coming online very shortly, so that'll be interesting how that develops and where that wine ends up going. I think most likely sparkling to start with, because on a heavy clay, which we don't have much here. When I get more time, I'll go back to my plant breeding. I think I've bred some. I've already crossed Blair Frankish with Nebbiolo and made a new variety, which I've got growing in my pool. And I think I'll probably continue that, trying to find other varieties that we can call our own in Australia or in Tasmania. So probably, ideally blending things that I like, say Nebbiolo with Pinot, and see what comes out the other end, because I think there's room to have other varieties that we can call our own rather than these other great, they're all good varieties, that they have in Europe. But I think there's room for Australia to have its own. And so if nobody else is going to do it, I'll just do it myself.
Yeah, I think there's plenty that you are doing yourself and have done yourself. What do you do when you actually relax?
I like fly fishing, pretty much, or any sort of fishing, really, when I do get time. And just, again, walking in the vineyard. I really, it's not a chore. I love walking the dog in the vineyard, hiking and fishing. They're my main loves, I suppose. Yeah. And helping other people out, helping Marco, building things, machinery and all sorts of stuff. It's lots of fun.
All right. And what are you going to be drinking tonight?
Ooh, got a good fridge full of stuff there. So I've been drinking sparkling all day. I had a sparkling tasting day, so we went through about 30 wines. So no sparkling, but I don't know. I think probably a red. I think a nice Moorilla Muscalese would be nice. Either that or, I think a Pinot or a Pinot. Good Tassie Pinot. One or the other. Depends on what's on the menu.
Well, who's cooking?
Oh, we don't know. I haven't decided that yet. Haven't seen Monique. So when she gets here, we'll make a plan.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like, subscribe and share with everyone. I mean it. Your support makes a huge difference. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. Feel free to leave a comment too. I'd love to know what you'd like to hear more of. But for now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, and to my guest, Steve Lubiana. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.